The Bible often describes anger in terminology that is consistent with fire. And this analogy is helpful since fire can be useful or harmful. Fire can be used to cook our food, or it can burn down our house. Anger is an emotion that man received from God as those who have been made in His image. We read in many instances in the Old Testament where God expresses His anger. Christ expressed His anger when He walked this earth, and God commands Christians to be angry and do not sin in Ephesians 4:26. What this means is that anger itself is not sinful, but as with all God's gifts, it can be used sinfully. A righteous use of anger can lead us to stand up to things like abortion, while a sinful use of anger can lead a husband to be abusive to his wife. This is why it is important for us to have a biblical understanding of anger, since God gave us the capacity for anger, since He wants us to be angry at the things that He is angry at, and to use that anger in righteous ways to bring about His glory and the good of others. David Powlison provides a really good discussion about this in his book, Good and Angry. And when it comes to terms to define, the study guide wants you to define anger. And a good definition for anger comes from Robert Jones in his book, Uprooting Anger, where he says that anger is a whole person's active response of negative moral judgment against a perceived evil. I highly recommend that you look up this definition and his explanation in order to include that in your answer. And when it comes to Bible verses to reference, here are some good suggestions. James verses 1 through 4 is the main text that you should include in your answer and use it to talk about anger, because this is a passage that clearly indicates that anger comes from inside our hearts and not something that is forced upon us by outside circumstances. James 1 verses 19 through 20 is another good passage that talks about how sin is the result of our desires. Matthew 5:21 and 22 is another significant passage on anger, since it is here that Jesus teaches that on a heart level, sinful anger is just as bad as murder, since anger toward another person results from that person prohibiting you from getting what you want. And thus, you want that person eliminated from out of your way, and the greatest form of elimination is to kill them, which is why Jesus teaches that anger and hatred and murder are all on the same level in your heart. A good outline for your answer to this question would include these elements. First, that you would provide a good biblical definition of anger. And again, Robert Jones' definition is a good place to start. It would also be good to discuss the difference between divine and human anger, as well as the difference between righteous and sinful anger. Second, you should discuss the differences between the outward expressions of anger and the inward expressions of anger. Outward manifestations are things like yelling, harsh words, and actions associated with anger, while the inward responses of anger include things like bitterness and resentment as the individual dwells on their thoughts of anger towards individuals. Both the resources by Jay Adams and Lou Priolo in the study guide will be helpful for you here. Third, you will need to discuss the biblical factors that drive anger, which are described by the passages in James and are connected to things like pride, envy, selfishness, and a lack of patience, possibly a love for money, and a host of other examples. Last, you ought to provide some biblical strategies and steps that would encourage counselees to change. The resources from Robert Jones, David Powlison, and Stuart Scott will be really helpful for you in this regard. In short, you should talk about the need for repentance, the process of putting off and putting on, as discussed in Ephesians chapter 4, and the teaching of Jesus in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 18. These chapters instruct us that when there is anger between individuals, whether we are the offended or the offender, we have the responsibility to go to the other person and be reconciled.